There's only so much you can see between the clay, the water, but it's real. And that's the important part. There's a wood structure down there. And at that point, it becomes, okay, you can't stop now.
Rick Lagina was not supposed to be in that part of the island. The afternoon had been administrative, the kind of day that every active field investigation produces occasionally, where logistics and planning and the organizational machinery of a serious operation demand attention that pulls key people away from the fieldwork itself. Rick had been in meetings most of the day, paperwork that couldn't wait, conversations with consultants who needed decisions before they could proceed. By 4 in the afternoon, he'd cleared enough of it to step outside. He didn't go to the active excavation area. He didn't walk to the research building. He walked, the way he often walked when the desk work released him, in the general direction of the island's interior, following the kind of unplanned route that years of moving around the same piece of ground produces in a person who has absorbed its geography into muscle memory. He'd walked this part of the island hundreds of times. He knew where the ground rose and where it dipped. He knew which sections held moisture after rain and which drained quickly. He knew the way the light fell across the terrain in late afternoon in a way that was different from morning light, flatter, longer shadowed, producing a surface texture that made the ground look different from the same ground seen at a different hour. It was the late afternoon light that showed him what he would never have seen at any other time of day. A shadow that didn't belong, not dramatic, not a gaping opening or a visible construction, or anything that would have registered as significant from any angle other than the specific angle Rick was walking from, at the specific hour that cast shadows, at the specific length and direction that made the depression visible at all. Rick stopped, looked, took 3 steps to the left to change his viewing angle. The shadow was still wrong, still inconsistent with how shadows fell across every other section of ground he was looking at. He crouched down and looked at the earth itself. What he saw, once he was at ground level, once his eyes had adjusted to the specific way the surface presented itself from that vantage point, was something he had walked past, potentially hundreds of times, without seeing. The ground had a mouth. Subscribe, because Rick Lagina just found a secret tunnel on Oak Island that may lead straight to the treasure, and the story of how a man who has devoted 20 years of his life to the world's most famous mystery found it on an unplanned afternoon walk in a location nobody had been looking because the light was right. For the first time in all those years is the Oak Island story that nobody saw coming. The believer Rick Lagina arrived at Oak Island the way dreamers arrive at the things they've spent their lives imagining, with a combination of anticipation and vulnerability that people who don't dream that particular dream tend to underestimate. He had been thinking about this island since he was 11 years old, since a magazine article about the money pit and its unsolved mystery had landed in his hands in Michigan and produced the specific fascination that certain mysteries produce in certain minds, the kind that doesn't dissolve when you set the article down, that resurfaces periodically across decades, that quietly shapes a person's relationship to unsolved things in general. Rick Lagina grew up to be a man who believed that the world contained genuine mysteries worth pursuing. Not naively, he understood the difference between genuine mysteries and convenient ones, between evidence that warranted serious investigation and stories that warranted only enjoyment. But he carried from childhood an orientation toward the unexplained that was the opposite of dismissal. The dismisser's position, that unexplained phenomena are typically explained by human credulity rather than genuine anomaly, is defensible and often correct. But the dismisser pays a price for the defensive posture. They miss the things that are genuinely there, hidden in the category of things they've decided aren't worth looking for. Rick never paid that price. He looked. When the opportunity to actually pursue the Oak Island investigation presented itself, when the combination of family capital, his brother Marty's business expertise, and the specific historical moment when the operation could be organized at a serious scale all converged. Rick didn't hesitate. "I've been thinking about this since I was 11, he said, simply and without embarrassment, to every journalist who asked why he was doing it. "It's either real or it isn't. I want to know which." What 20 years of investigation had produced in Rick Lagina was something more complex than the vindication or disappointment that simple answers would have provided. It had produced a relationship with the island, personal, sustained, layered with the specific texture of years of close attention to a place that was revealing itself incrementally rather than all at once. Rick knew this island, not as a studied subject, but as a known place. The way you know places you have walked in every season, in every weather, at every hour. The way familiarity with a landscape builds a model in the nervous system that goes beyond what conscious observation records. That model, built from 20 years of walking the same ground, was what told him, on an unremarkable administrative afternoon, that the shadow he was seeing didn't belong. 20 years of looking. Most people who haven't been part of a sustained long-term investigation misunderstand what 20 years of focused attention to a single subject does to a person's perception. The common assumption is that extended investigation breeds either obsession, the narrowing of attention to a single track that excludes peripheral information, or fatigue, the gradual dulling of attention that comes from sustained engagement without resolution. Rick Lagina's 20 years on Oak Island had produced neither. What sustained, disciplined attention to a complex site actually produces, in the people with the specific temperament to sustain it, is depth of pattern recognition. The ability to detect anomalies against a background that has been so thoroughly observed that normal variation is fully accounted for, leaving only the genuinely abnormal to register. This is what experienced naturalists develop for ecosystems they've observed across years, what detectives develop for crime scenes they've worked extensively, what geologists develop for landscapes they've mapped in detail. The background is so well known that anything inconsistent with it stands out with a clarity that a fresh set of eyes, paradoxically, couldn't achieve, because the fresh eyes have no background to detect deviation from. Rick had spent 20 years building that background for Oak Island. Every section of the island's surface had been walked, examined, discussed, surveyed, and revised in his understanding across those years. The terrain's variations, its rises and depressions, its drainage patterns, its surface vegetation changes, and the specific places where ground behavior suggested subsurface features that weren't visible at the surface, were all part of the model that 20 years of presence had built. It was that model that generated the alert when the shadow didn't belong. Not a dramatic discovery moment. Not the theatrical breakthrough of popular imagination. A pattern recognition event, the nervous system flagging a deviation from an established background. The 20-year accumulation of knowledge about what this island normally looks like, producing a clear signal when something presented as not normal. Rick had been waiting for that signal for 20 years, without knowing what form it would take. It took the form of a shadow that fell wrong on a late afternoon in October, on a section of ground he had walked past hundreds of times in a part of the island that investigation focus had always treated as secondary to the primary excavation zone. The opening, Rick didn't call anyone immediately. He spent 40 minutes at the site on his own first, not excavating, not disturbing anything, just observing from different angles and distances, building the picture of what he was actually looking at before introducing other people's interpretations into his own. This was a habit he'd developed across 20 years of Oak Island work, the practice of making his own assessment before group discussion, because group assessments had a way of converging on the first confident interpretation offered rather than on the most accurate one. What he observed across those 40 minutes built a picture that had several distinct components. The depression in the ground was not natural subsidence. Natural subsidence in the Oak Island geology, which Rick knew intimately by this point, produced specific surface signatures, gradual, bowl-shaped, with surface vegetation responding to the moisture and drainage changes that subsidence creates. What he was looking at had different characteristics. The edges were more defined. The vegetation transition was abrupt rather than gradual, and the orientation of the depression, its longest axis, followed a bearing that pointed, when Rick mentally extended it, directly toward the primary money pit zone on the island's eastern end. A linear depression with non-natural edges oriented toward the money pit. Rick had read enough about the Oak Island system, had absorbed enough of the historical accounts, the engineering analyses, the documented characteristics of the flood tunnel network, to know what a surface expression of a subsurface linear passage looked like. He had seen those descriptions in documents. He was looking at those characteristics in the ground. He stood up, took one more look at the orientation, confirmed mentally that the bearing was what he thought it was. Then he took out his phone. He called the team lead, not with the specific restrained excitement of someone managing their own reaction for an audience, but with the focused directness of a person who has found something specific and needs specific people to respond to it. "I need the ground-penetrating radar at my location," Rick said. "Today, before we lose the light, I've found something." The GPR team arrived 45 minutes later. What the equipment showed in the first pass directly over the depression confirmed what Rick's 40 minutes of observation had suggested, and elevated it beyond suggestion into something that required an entirely different response. Directly beneath the surface depression, at a depth beginning at approximately 6 feet and continuing to a depth the first pass data couldn't fully characterize, the GPR was returning signatures consistent with an open passage, a void space with linear dimensions, and an orientation that the equipment's output displayed as a clear directional feature running toward the northeast, toward the money pit. What the ground shows. The ground-penetrating radar survey that followed Rick's initial discovery ran for 3 days. Not 3 days of continuous work on the single depression. 3 days of systematic expansion of the survey area, building a complete picture of what the subsurface was showing across the region of the island where Rick had made the initial observation, and the surrounding ground that the first data suggested might be relevant. The lead GPR operator was careful in her language during those 3 days. GPR data is real data, but GPR interpretation involves uncertainties that responsible operators don't minimize. The difference between consistent with a passage and confirmed passage is a distinction that matters when extraordinary claims are at stake. But across 3 days of surveys from multiple angles and at multiple frequencies, the picture that assembled itself in the processed data was consistent enough to move the characterization forward. The subsurface feature was not a single short void. The GPR returns showed a linear feature, strongest signal directly below the surface depression Rick had found, progressively deeper as the feature extended toward the northeast, maintaining consistent dimensional signatures across the extent of the survey area. The depth profile was significant. At the point of the surface depression, the feature began at approximately 6 feet. As it extended northeast, toward the Money Pit zone, the feature's signature deepened, consistent with a passage that descended toward the depth range where the primary vault structure had always been hypothesized to exist. "What you're looking at," the GPR operator told Rick after the third day's data was processed, "is a linear subsurface feature that begins close to the surface where you found the depression and descends toward a depth consistent with the Money Pit's known subsurface profile as it extends toward that area. The dimensional signatures are consistent with a passage of human-made rather than natural origin. I can't tell you with certainty what it is. I can tell you it's not geology. It's not geology." In the GPR operator's careful professional language, that was as clear as the data allowed her to be. Rick heard it clearly. The question of design, the GPR survey had established the subsurface feature's characteristics with enough consistency to work from. The investigation turned to a question that Rick found more fascinating than the simple confirmation of the feature's existence. Why was it there? The Oak Island Vault System, as understood through the historical accounts, the engineering analyses, and the physical evidence accumulated across the investigation, was designed around a specific defensive logic. The flood tunnels connected the Money Pit area to the sea, defeating excavation attempts from above. The depth of the primary vault protected it from surface approaches. The system was, in the assessment of every engineer who had studied it seriously, a sophisticated and integrated defense designed by people who thought carefully about what they were protecting and how to protect it. Within that framework, a tunnel running from a surface access point toward the Money Pit zone was not immediately consistent with the defensive logic. Tunnels are access features. Defense features keep people out. What was a tunnel access feature doing in a system designed to keep people out? Rick spent time with that question, not because it undermined the significance of the find, but because he had learned across 20 years of investigation that the interesting questions about Oak Island were always the ones that didn't immediately resolve. The answer he arrived at, through discussion with the historical researchers and engineers who were now engaged with the tunnel's characteristics, was a reframing of the defensive assumption. The vault system wasn't only designed to keep intruders out. It was designed to allow authorized access. Whoever built the system needed to be able to get back in. The flood tunnels and the depth and the engineering sophistication of the Money Pit area were defenses against unauthorized access. But a functioning secure deposit also needs a route that authorized parties can use. The tunnel Rick had found might be that route, not a vulnerability in the system, not an overlooked oversight by builders who had otherwise engineered brilliantly. A feature, a designed access passage that the authorized parties could use while the flood defenses blocked everyone else. "Think about what they built," Rick explained during a team discussion of the tunnel's significance. A deposit they intended to retrieve at some point. That's the assumption the whole system runs on. They needed to be able to get in without triggering their own flood defenses. They needed a route that bypassed the flooding mechanism. If this tunnel connects to the vault from outside the flood tunnel network, it's not an accident. It's the key. The key. The passage that the vault's builders used and then sealed. Sealed well enough that 228 years of searching hadn't found it until a late afternoon shadow fell at the right angle on the right October day. The history beneath the history. Rick Lagina's discovery of the tunnel required the investigation's historians to go back to the archival record with a new question. Previous historical research on Oak Island had focused on the vault, what it contained, when it was built, who built it, and what historical circumstances had motivated its construction. The access question, how authorized parties got in and out, had been acknowledged theoretically but never developed specifically because the physical evidence for an access passage had never been available to develop against. Now it was available, and the historians who went back to the archival record looking specifically for references to access routes, rather than to the vault itself, found something that had been in the record all along without being recognized as significant. A letter held in a private correspondence collection in London that the investigation's archival team had accessed years earlier, but not exhaustively analyzed, contained a passing reference to the approach from the western portion, in the context of a broader discussion that was clearly in retrospect about the Oak Island system. The western portion, not the money pit, which was on the island's eastern end. The western portion, which was where Rick had found the surface depression. The letter dated from the 1790s. It was not specific enough to confirm the tunnel independently. It was a reference in a private letter, not an engineering document, but it was consistent with the existence of an access passage approaching the vault system from the western side of the island, consistent with the feature Rick had found, consistent with the orientation and the depth profile the GPR survey had documented. One letter was suggestive, not confirmatory, but in the specific evidentiary context of an active investigation that had just found a physical feature consistent with what the letter described, the correspondence between the archival reference and the physical evidence was the kind of convergence that serious historical investigation treated as significant. We had this letter in the archive and didn't know what it was referring to, one historian noted. Now we might. The approach from the western portion, if that's what we think it is, was in the record the whole time. We just didn't have the physical evidence to know which part of the record to take seriously. This was, Rick reflected, a near-perfect expression of how Oak Island consistently worked. What 20 years prepared. Rick Lagina found the tunnel on an unplanned afternoon walk in October. That framing, luck, accident, the right light at the right moment, contains something true, but misses something more important. The walk was unplanned. The discovery was not accidental. What Rick brought to that walk, the 20 years of accumulated pattern recognition, the complete internalized model of the island's normal surface presentation that made the shadow's wrongness immediately detectable, the decades of immersion in the investigation's historical and physical evidence that allowed him to recognize the orientation of a linear depression as significant within 40 minutes of observation. None of that was luck. He found it because he was the specific person who had built the specific capability to find it, walking in a specific place at a specific time of day when the light conditions made it visible. Remove any of those elements, and the tunnel doesn't get found that day. A different person, without the pattern recognition model built from 20 years of the same ground, might have walked past the same shadow without stopping. The same person at a different time of day, when the light didn't produce the specific shadow angle, might have walked past without the anomaly presenting itself to his peripheral attention. The same person without the 20 years of historical context might have crouched at the depression and not understood what the orientation was telling him. I've been asked whether it was luck, Rick said in the first interview he gave after the discovery became public. My answer is, it was the kind of luck that only comes to people who've been in the right place for long enough. I didn't choose to walk that direction that afternoon, but I chose to be on this island for 20 years. The walk was random. The 20 years wasn't. That formulation, the only genuine insight about luck that years of serious pursuit tend to produce, was Rick Lagina at his most essential. The believer who had shown up long enough for the thing he believed in to show itself. The significance of the access route. If the tunnel Rick discovered is confirmed as the authorized access route that the vault's builders used, and the convergent evidence from the GPR data, the surface characteristics, and the archival reference was building toward that confirmation. The implications for the investigation went significantly beyond the tunnel itself. An access route changes the operational picture for retrieving whatever is in the vault. The Oak Island retrieval problem had always been framed around the vault's defenses, the flood tunnel system, the depth, the specific engineering challenges of reaching 100 feet in the face of a water defense that defeated conventional excavation. Every retrieval approach across 228 years had been designed as an attack on those defenses. A designed access route is not a defense. It is, by definition, a designed path through the defenses. If the tunnel provided access to the vault in a way that bypassed the flood system, which its orientation, originating from the west side of the island and potentially approaching the vault from outside the flood tunnel network's coverage, suggested it might, then the retrieval problem was not the problem everyone had been solving. The problem everyone had been solving was, how do you defeat the flood defenses? The problem that the tunnel's existence potentially transformed it into, how do you use the access route the builders provided? We've been attacking the fortress walls for 228 years, Rick said during a team planning discussion after the GPR survey results were fully processed. There might be a door. Whether the tunnel remained passable, whether 228 years of geological processes and the specific moisture and pressure conditions of the Nova Scotia subsurface had maintained the passage in a condition that could be accessed, was a separate question from whether the tunnel existed. The GPR data confirmed existence. Condition required physical investigation. Physical investigation of the tunnel was being planned with the care that the discovery warranted. Archaeological assessment before any penetration, structural evaluation of the passage's integrity before any human access, documentation protocols that would preserve the find's physical and historical record regardless of what the passage contained or led to. Rick was involved in that planning in the specific way that had defined his role on the island across 20 years, not as the engineer developing the technical protocols, but as the person whose sustained attention to the site's full picture, historical, physical, intuitive, kept the planning grounded in what the island was actually showing, rather than what the investigation wanted it to show.